Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Bilingualism and Multilingualism. I am Dr. Verma from the Department of Cognitive Sciences at IIT Kanpur, and I am going to talk to you about bilingualism and multilingualism and their consequences for other cognitive functions today. Now, so far in the previous lectures, we have studied about the various aspects of language acquisition and use in bilinguals. We've also studied about the elaborate system of control that is required by bilinguals to manage the two languages. In the most recent set of lectures, we talked about the neural correlates of language acquisition, use, production, comprehension, and also language control. However, while we are sort of moving to the conclusion of this course and moving toward a conclusion about the behavior of bilinguals and multilinguals, it is important for us in the spirit of Fodor's modularity argument, which we took up when we began the course, to sort of also examine whether bilingualism or multilingualism has any influences on other cognitive functions as well. In this next set of lectures starting today, we will go through some of the cognitive functions that may actually get influenced because of an individual being bilingual or multilingual. Now, one of the pertinent questions within language research has been the relationship between language and thought. A bunch of researchers in the early 19th century have actually grappled with the issue and approached the question in ingenious ways. In fact, in one of the previous courses that I took on the Introduction to the Psychology of Language, I have also discussed this issue in great detail, and if you remember, we actually saw that although language and thought can actually exist independent of each other, and there is a sort of a double dissociation where there have been individuals who can actually speak, but they cannot, who can actually have completely fine language but not coherent thought patterns, and also individuals who have deficiency in language but completely fine thought patterns. Also, if you look at imagery, if you look at other sensory modalities, it is perfectly plausible for people to have perfectly fine thought patterns without the aid of language. We also saw the case of Brother John, a French monk, who was having epileptic seizures where he could not even talk to himself but could actually carry out operations that would come within the domain of thought. Similarly, we saw Williams syndrome patients who had fluent output of language but a very incoherent thought pattern and so on. So, while there is a lot of research on the fact that whether language and thought are related to each other or not, or how they are related, or let us say, as we say, that whether it is a chicken or an egg problem, the contemporary research actually suggests that language and thought are relatively independent from each other, although they might have some kind of influence on each other which cannot be denied. A bunch of researchers in the early 19th century, for example Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Worf, actually grappled with this idea and came up with what is called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which proposed that the languages we speak actually also influences our ways of thinking. Interestingly, researchers actually now acknowledge that while there may be innumerable ways to perceive the world, the languages of the world do actually differ in the way they the languages map the concepts onto linguistic structures. Moreover, the theory also states that we may indeed perceive the world through the lenses of our respective languages, attending to and noticing the aspects of the world that are reflected and expressed clearly in our languages, and ignoring the aspects of the world that are not encoded as well in our languages. Indeed, research is replete with evidence that shows that languages do carve out the world differently. For instance, the English words ladder and staircase map onto the same single Russian word. Also, famously, it was pointed out by even Sapir and Worf that Inuit speakers may have different words for snow falling. For instance, they have a different word kanik for snow that is falling down, and aput for the snow that has touched the ground. Similar differences have also been found to occur between linguistic structures of other types of concepts as well. For example, the information encoded in a verb, in languages verb forms like gender, number, and tense information. A very interesting illustration explanation of the kind has been offered by Boroditsky and colleagues, which is cited by de Groot, and which says, to say the elephant ate the peanuts in English, we must include the tense, the fact that the event happened in the past. In Mandarin, indicating when the event occurred would be optional and could not be included in the verb. In Russian, on the other hand, the verb would need to include not only tense information, but also whether the peanut eater was male or female, and whether the peanut eater finished all of the peanuts or just a portion of them. In Turkish, one would need to specify also that whether the event being reported was actually witnessed or was just hearsay. So, the fact that languages dissect the world differently is not really a contested point because there is so much evidence in favor of it. Neither is the fact that the speakers of different languages may attend to different aspects of the world, which is also again very prevalent in popular knowledge, and you keep hearing anecdotes around it and so on. But the point of contention with the linguistic determinism hypothesis is the proposal that language determines thought in such a way that only the concepts capable of being expressed in the vocabulary and the grammatical constructions can actually be grasped, and other concepts that are not very clearly imbibed or encoded in the language cannot be grasped by the speakers of this language. For instance, a proposal could be that according to linguistic determinism, speakers of Hopi, an American Indian language, would lack the concept of time seen as a dimension because the language does not distinguish between the various corresponding tenses in English. However, it has been shown, and it is quite possible, that a speaker of Hopi may be able to grasp the concept of time as a dimension when they were explicitly trained to do so, or via another language. In other words, even though the conceptual space of speakers of a particular language is likely to depend upon the distinctions present in their language, it should not, or it does not necessarily imply that they will not be able to pick up these concepts. In some sense, it does not limit their cognitive capabilities at all. It is only the grasping through that specific language that is limited, and when speakers are given an option and trained and talked about these things, they might be able to grasp these other concepts as well. A very interesting example of this kind is presented by Dani, a tribe in New Guinea, that although have only 2 words for color in their language, but these people were able to learn the much more varied set of English color names without a lot of trouble. In the same way, Boroditsky demonstrated that while the native speakers of Mandarin Chinese and English actually think about time in different ways, whereas Chinese represent time in a vertical dimension and English represents time in a horizontal dimension, it took only a small amount of training in Mandarin Chinese for the English speakers to start appreciating and to be able to think vertically about time. So if you look at these evidences actually provide, a lot of question to the against the validity of the stronger linguistic determinism hypothesis. However, the slightly weaker version of this hypothesis that we mentioned earlier, which is the linguistic relativity hypothesis, has recently found favor amongst scientists. For example, scientists make distinction between the contents of thought and the processes of thinking, such as attending, remembering, or reasoning. Indeed, some researchers have actually started focusing on the contents of thought, which may be limited by the language, and the processes by which we arrive at such thought. So there are scientists who are actually working on whether the contents of thought are determined by language, or the process of arriving at a thought are determined by language, or both of these things. And that basically opens up a larger possibility of research into the relationship between language and thought. Indeed, a seminal work on these lines in this tradition was presented by Gentner and Gold in Meadow in 3 volumes. They published 3 books titled Language as Lens, Does the Language We Acquire Influence How We See the World? Language as a Toolkit, Does the Language We Acquire Augment Our Capacity for Higher Order Representation and Reasoning? Language as a Category Marker, Does the Language We Acquire Influence Where We Make Our Category Distinction? So in that sense, these 3 books actually chart out this debate in much more detail, and is a highly recommended read from my side. Also, the nature of more recent research in the relationship of language and thought is slightly more nuanced than earlier. For example, the more recent work is more careful with regards to the type of evidence that would that would be counted in support of the fact that language influences thought. For example, a closer examination at some of the earlier studies reveals that several studies examining this relationship have exclusively used verbal tasks, which makes it difficult to interpret the evidence, because you cannot use verbal stimuli to judge something about the language processing, to judge something about whether language processing has an impact on thought processes. In that regard, to avoid this kind of indeterminacy or confounds, evidence from non-verbal tasks might be more useful, such as classification, memory, sorting, and matching, which are non-verbal tasks and which can still yield whether speakers of different languages have different kinds of thought and reasoning processes. Also, the more recent work in this direction considers the possibility that linguistic relativity might apply in some conditions but not in all conditions. So, for example, Boroditsky and others have hypothesized that language may exert an especially strong influence on the formation of abstract nominal concepts such as time, concepts representing abstract activities such as thinking or loving, hating, etc., and relational concepts. They reason in the fashion that because in order to learn these concepts, individuals have to typically rely on their linguistic experience. Therefore, their linguistic experience actually limits, or in some sense scaffolds, the type of learning that they would have with respect to these concepts. Finally, recent work also expresses the awareness that the effects of language and thought are often confounded with the effects of culture and thought. Remember that languages do imbibe a lot of cultural practices between them, and a lot of effects that we might be interpreting as effects of language might actually in fact be effects of cultural differences between two cultures. Say for example, the French and the English are different cultures, whereas the Indian and the French are also very different cultures. Now, interestingly, while there has been much debate about the relationship between language and thought, the phenomenon of bilingualism has surprisingly stayed out of this debate. Most studies have made cross-linguistic comparisons of some content of thought between monolingual speakers of two or more different languages, which differ in ways such as tense, number, or gender agreement. In fact, Pavlenko points out that bilinguals have been kept out of this research mainly because they are sort of messy and will make interpretations more difficult. On the other hand, Pavlenko actually opines that research on linguistic relativity should certainly include bilingualism as a case, because bilinguals may be the only individuals that have the first-hand experience of the effects of linguistic relativity because of their experience with the two separate linguistic systems within their own conceptual space. Also, Athanasopoulos favored the inclusion of bilingualism in studying the relationship between language and thought on the grounds that majority of the people in the world actually speak more than one language, and therefore it makes sense that a theory of relationship between language and thought would be incomplete if it does not take into account bilingualism and bilingual speakers. Now, an interesting aspect of bilingual studies of linguistic relativity has been the question of whether and to what extent bilinguals actually experience different conceptual worlds when communicating in their one or a different language. Now, this is something that I'm sure a lot of you could relate with. For example, for us Indians, when we are speaking in English, it is typically a very formal setting, a very inhibited, very sort of conscious kind of a setting. And when we switch to our own native language, be it Hindi, Tamil, Telugu, Bengali, or Malayalam, we tend to become less formal, more confident, more creative, and so on and so forth. So, indeed, it seems that there is a difference between how bilinguals actually perform in their two languages, and how do they feel about the world in their two languages. On this account, anecdotal evidence actually exists of bicultural bilinguals who actually describe that they experience a personal transformation into a different conceptual world when they switch to their other language. For example, when you're speaking in school in English with your teachers and your colleagues which may not understand Hindi or Bangla, you come out as a very different person as opposed to when you're speaking at home in Hindi or Bangla or any of your first language with your family members. Now, these experiences actually align with the notion of coordinate bilingualism that we have discussed before, and at the same time provide evidence that switching of languages does not necessarily require a simultaneous switching of socio-cultural circumstances. It is just that you can access the other cultures through this languages of the other kind. Now, these anecdotes also provide evidence against a very strong and deterministic view of the theory, as espoused by linguistic determinism by Sapir and Worf. Now, there are some more interesting questions that I would want to leave you with before I wrap this particular lecture up. And these are questions about the bilingual's relationship between language and thought. The questions could be, are there any binaries? I mean, are these stages between the L1 cultural or conceptual world and L2 conceptual world binary stages? So for example, when I'm speaking in English and when I'm speaking in Hindi, am I basically experiencing a binary split personality? Or there could be any intermediate stages during which a bilingual is gradually transforming from being a primary L1 cultural member to being one belonging to the L2 culture. For instance, is there an initial stage of L2 acquisition in which the new language is exploiting the conceptual world associated with the L1 and gradually transforming it in its own way? So this is again similar to subordinative bilingualism that we have talked about in the beginning lectures. Moreover, it can also be wondered whether a pattern of gradual conceptual shift can be detected en route to the state of the two conceptual worlds. So how do you start learning a second language? Is there an intermediate stage? And eventually when you are proficient in both languages, what kind of a world is that? So can certain contexts be identified that ultimately lead to a blended conceptual world which is shared by the two languages basically is different from the conceptual worlds of the monolingual speakers of either language? Given that I am a bilingual and I'm not a Hindi monolingual and I'm not an English monolingual, are these three worlds actually different? Is my world a composite of some of the Hindi speakers world and some of the English speakers world? Or it is basically still a divided entity that has two subsets, English subset and a Hindi subset? This is also something very, very interesting, and it resembles the concept of compound bilingualism that we have thought about earlier. I would like to leave you pondering about these questions at the end of this lecture, and I will discuss these topics in much more detail as I go ahead in the next lectures of this series. Thank you, and I'll see you with more on language and thought in the next lecture. Thank you.